Chapter 17. Guildford, England, July 1986. Richard walked through the car park towards the 19th-century Artington house with its brick gables and twisted wisteria. It stood behind manicured lawns shaded by tall trees in full summer leaf. The roar of traffic from Portsmouth Road retreated behind him as he climbed the steps to its main entrance. At first she had denied it, insisted he had made some kind of mistake, but when he threatened to go up to the attic to retrieve the certificate, she had forbidden him. He had never to go up there again. It was off-limits. And then she simply refused to discuss it. He had exams to study for and better things with which to fill his head. And as far as she was concerned, that was an end to it. But for Richard, it was just the beginning. He had retired to his room then and looked around it for the last time without the least sense of emotion. These were the walls that had contained him for most of his 17 years, home to the accumulated junk of childhood, his collection of toy soldiers, posters and paintings and albums, his old rugby strip hanging over the back of a chair, his Spanish guitar. So many things he knew he would never miss. He packed a sports bag with some underwear, a couple of T-shirts, a pair of jeans, tennis shoes, and a pair of open-toed sandals. He took all his savings from the envelope he had taped beneath his desk drawer and stuffed it in his wallet. He lifted his favourite denim jacket from the back of the door, slipped his passport into an inside pocket, and released the catch that held his bedroom window. He dropped through the dark into the little square of garden behind the arched gate that led to the lane beyond, and crouched there for a moment listening to the sound of the cicadas. The warm evening air was filled with the scent of bougainvillea and pine and the smell of the sea. As his eyes adjusted, he glanced down to where phosphorescent waves broke over glistening black rock 50 feet below. The sea felt alive. His sea. He could hear it breathing. It was the only thing he would miss. The woman behind the desk in the office smiled at him. He said he had phoned earlier about acquiring a copy of his brother's death certificate. She remembered him, and he was struck by how readily she took him at face value. He might have been born in this country, but he had spent all his conscious life in France. He spoke French with a southern accent. He listened to Francis Cabrel and Serge Gainsborough. He had a crush on France Gall. And yet his English was so convincing, this woman took him for a native. Perhaps he even looked English. One more chip out of his sense of self. She produced the freshly printed extract and signed it, and he paid for it with the strange notes and coins for which he had exchanged his francs at the Bureau de Change in London, before catching the train down to Surrey. He glanced at the certificate, and felt again the touch of icy fingers on his neck when he saw his name on it. "Can I see the original?" "I'm afraid not. The originals are all kept in our vaults and are not available for public scrutiny." She had a sense of something lost in his demeanour, and glanced again at the extract she had given him. "He died very young. Still a baby, really?" "Yes. He never had the chance to grow up." She looked at him and smiled again. "Maybe he'd have turned out a bit like you." Richard flashed her a look and felt his skin darkening. "No." His contradiction was unnecessarily abrupt. "It wouldn't have been anything like me." The traffic on the Mount was a distant whisper behind the walls of the cemetery. Somehow everything seemed quieter here. Richard sat in the grass next to a small headstone discoloured by time and moss, and traced the outline of his own name with tentative fingers. How many people, he wondered, got to visit their own grave? It was a hollowing experience. He felt tears burn his cheeks, and the emptiness inside him ached. If Richard really was dead, then who was he? Chapter 18. Enzo felt foolish, almost embarrassed. He wasn't going to die after all, at least not in the next 3 months, not if he could help it. And all that depression and self-pity in which he had been wallowing since his appointment with the phony oncologist seemed horribly indulgent, but he had learned something very valuable. Life was for living, to the full, every last precious second of it. He held both his daughters in an embrace that he wanted to go on forever. Sophie's tears were staining his shirt. She'd only had a single day to live with the knowledge of her father's impending death, a day that had seemed like an eternity, eyes burned red raw by endless tears, spilled now in happiness rather than grief. And Kirsty. He drew back to look at her. The proximity of death had taught them something about themselves, forced both a confrontation and a reconciliation. There was no past, no history. Today was the first day of the rest of their lives, lives to be lived in the moment. Unfortunately, at this particular moment Enzo still stood accused of murder, and whoever it was that was trying to ruin his life was still out there, capable of God only knew what else. His tiny cell seemed full of people. He hardly knew who they all were. Nicole insinuated herself between the half-sisters to thrust large breasts at her mentor and crush him with a bear-hugging ferocity. "Shouldn't you be at university?" he said. She cocked her head at him. "Classes have been cancelled, Monsieur MacLeod. Apparently our professor's been arrested on some trumped-up murder charge, and he'll probably need my help to solve it like he usually does." He smiled at her fondly. She was his brightest student and had already proved an invaluable assistant in helping him solve 2 of the murders in Raffin's book. A big girl of farming stock, what she lacked in the social graces she made up for in intelligence. Long straight hair that reached down almost as far as her ample hips was pulled back severely from a round, pretty face and tied in a ponytail. She frowned at him. "I can't let you out of my sight for a minute, can I?" He looked beyond her and saw Bertrand at the open door, uniformed officers at his back, and he felt the desolation in the young man's eyes. There was something different about him. Odd. Then Enzo realized that the nose stud and eyebrow piercings had gone. His face seemed strangely naked without them. Gone, too, were the spikes gelled into hair which was now swept simply back from a pale forehead. He looked older, as if, suddenly, in the face of tragedy, he had been forced finally to discard his youth. Enzo held out his hand, and the boy shook it firmly. "What's the situation with the gym?" Bertrand made a face. "It's history. The fire chief says it was arson. There was an accelerant used." Years of study and work lost in a single night of flames. "I'm so sorry, Bertrand." "Why, it's not your fault. I feel responsible." But Bertrand wouldn't have it. "Don't. Whatever I've lost I can rebuild." He glanced at Kirsty. "You nearly lost a daughter." Kirsty reached out to touch his arm. The bond between them was evident. When someone saves your life, you owe him forever. When you are the one who saved the life, you become, in some way, responsible for it. Bertrand and Sophie were lovers, and while that might some day come to an end, his relationship with Kirsty was for life. Sophie said, "The Maison de la Jeunesse has offered him temporary space, and the bank have said they'll give him a bridging loan to re-equip until the insurance money comes through." Bertrand shrugged bravely. "All I've got to do is figure out how to make the payments." Out in the hallway they heard a metal door slam shut, and voices, and a man appeared behind Bertrand. He was wearing a suit, thinning dark hair dragged back from a bearded face. It was so rarely that Enzo saw Simon in a suit that he almost didn't recognize him. "Uncle Si!" Sophie threw herself at him with the unrestrained pleasure of a child greeting a favourite uncle, except that he wasn't really her uncle. Kirsty took his hand and kissed him on both cheeks, strangely formal, before Simon turned towards his oldest friend. He wasn't smiling. "How come they let everyone in here? I've got influence with the boss. Not enough to get you out, though." "No, not quite that much." Simon glanced at Kirsty. "Well, we'd better see what we can do to get your dad out, then." He stepped forward, and the 2 men stood looking at each other. They had started school together on the same day, aged 5. They had played in a band together through all their teen years, and now here they were in their 50s, facing one another across a police cell, one of them suspected of murder, the other his lawyer. The only call allowed to Enzo had been made to Simon in London. He couldn't practice law in France, but he had some influential connections in the French legal world. Enzo's first instinct was to hug him, but Simon preempted the embrace by holding out his hand for a formal handshake. "We'll get you the best avocat in the southwest. I've already spoken to some people in Toulouse." He seemed unusually detached, coldly professional. "They're allowing me a half-hour interview. You brief me, I'll brief the avocat. We'll need to clear the cell first."
"Not before we figure out what we can do in the meantime."
They all turned towards Nicole, who became suddenly self-conscious, and then defiant.
"Well, I'm not hanging about twiddling my thumbs while Monsieur MacLeod rots in here. There must be something we can do." "She's right, Dad," Kirsty said. "You must have some thoughts. You're an expert on crime scenes, after all."
"Oh, I've given it a lot of thought, believe me," Enzo said with some feeling. "And if I was investigating this thing myself, I'd start with a phony surgery in the Rue des Trois Baudous. Someone had access to that place. Someone with a key." He paused for just a moment. "And the hair they found on the victim's body? I've got a pretty damn good idea where that came from." The Cathedral of Saint-Étienne stands at the cultural and religious heart of the old Roman city of Cahors, a stunning example of the transition from late Romanesque architecture to Gothic. Resembling a fort more than a church, it was built in the 11th century by bishops who were also powerful feudal lords, defending their roles as counts and barons of the town. Now it stood in the repose of more tranquil times, a perch for pigeons, a repository for their guano, and the magnificent stained glass of the arched window in the apse looked out onto the barren winter gardens opposite the salon of coiffeur Xavier. Xavier was performing a red henna rinse on the head of a bird-like, middle-aged lady whose hair had gone prematurely grey and begun thinning alarmingly. She wanted her scalp to be the same colour as her hair to disguise the fact that she was balding. Xavier was trying to persuade her that the disguise was unlikely to work. The door opened, and the bell above it vibrated shrilly in the hot, ammoniac air of the salon. Xavier immediately sensed hostility. One of the two young women seemed faintly familiar, and he had certainly seen the young man before. A body like his, sculpted during hours of patient exercise, was one you wouldn't forget in a hurry. Attractive though he was, however, there was something distinctly aggressive in his manner. Xavier took a step back from the hennaed head.
"Bonjour, messieurs, dames."
He regarded them cautiously.
"Can I help?"
Kirsty looked around the cramped little salon with undisguised contempt. Why on earth would her father come here to get his hair trimmed? And almost as if she had read her sister's mind, Sophie said,
"He comes once a month on Thursdays. Thursday's training day."
Kirsty raised her eyes to the heavens and sighed. It was typical of her father to live out the world's stereotypical view of the mean Scot. She said,
"You cut our father's hair."
Xavier looked at her blankly.
"Who's your father?"
"Enzo MacLeod," Sophie said,
"and he's in prison on a murder charge because of you."
Xavier blanched.
"Me? I've never murdered anyone in my life." "It's running down my neck."
The bird-like lady squirmed in her seat, and Xavier glanced at the trails of red on white skin that disappeared beneath her plastic shoulder cover. But he was distracted. Kirsty said, "Hair found on the body of a woman murdered in Cahors 3 days ago matches my father's." Sophie pressed the point home.
"But that's not possible, since he wasn't there."
Kirsty finished the tirade.
"And he didn't kill that woman."
Xavier's pallor quickly turned pink as blood rushed to the surface of his skin.
"I don't see what that has to do with me." "Xavier, I can feel it running down my back."
Bertrand took a threatening step towards the hairdresser, who instinctively flinched, oblivious to the distress emanating from the redhead at his fingertips. "There's an easy way of doing this, Xavier, and there's a hard way. Your choice."
Okay.
Xavier raised his hands in self-defense. Red for stop.
"I admit it. I did give him some of Monsieur MacLeod's hair." "Who?"
Sophie looked as if she were about to physically attack him.
"He said it was for a joke." "Who?" I don't know who he was. He came in here about a month ago, just after Monsieur MacLeod had left, and said he wanted to buy some of his hair. You mean he took money for it? Sophie was incredulous, and her vehemence caused Xavier to take a further step back. I refused at first, but he was very persuasive, and in the end I didn't really see the harm. Well, you see it now, Bertrand glared at him. How much did he pay you? Honestly, I'd stick needles in my eyes before I'd do anything to hurt Monsieur MacLeod. Bertrand said, That might still be an option. How much? 100 euros. They stared at him, their disbelief reflected in Kirsty's astonishment. 100 euros? For some strands of hair? Xavier! The woman in the chair wailed. Xavier ignored her. He didn't want clippings. He wanted the hair that had come away in the comb. I hadn't even had a chance to clean it out. Monsieur MacLeod's chair was still warm. So this guy paid you 100 euros for a few lengths of my father's hair, and you didn't think that was odd? Kirsty's belligerence seemed almost as threatening now to Xavier as Bertrand's. Like I told you, he said it was for a joke. Some joke? Some joke. Xavier looked at Sophie and noticed for the first time, quite incongruously, the faint strip of white running back through her dark hair. "You've got this same badger stripe as your father," he said, as if he thought they might be distracted by this and forget about his transgressions. "Magpie," she said. "What?" "It's Magpie they call him, not Badger." Bertrand said, "I think you need to shut up your salon, Xavier, and come up to the caserne with us. The police are going to have to take a statement." "I don't want to get into any trouble." "Maybe you should have thought of that before you went selling your customers' hair." Xavier sighed theatrically, then took in the stripes of red on the neck of the client wriggling below him in her chair. "Oh, my God, what a mess!" He immediately began dabbing it with a wet sponge, but it had already begun to dry. "It'll take me a few minutes to sort this out." "We'll wait," Bertrand told him. And Kirsty said, "What did he look like? This guy that bought Enzo's hair?" Xavier waved a distracted hand in the air. "Oh, I don't know. I hardly remember him." "Try." Another theatrical sigh. "I suppose he must have been about 40-ish. Quite good-looking, really. His hair was short, I do remember that, sort of fair, and oh!" His eyes lit up. "Ears. Hairdressers always look at ears. You have to in this business. Too easy to cut one off." "What about his ears?" Kirsty was staring at him intently. "Well, it looked like he'd had a nasty accident in a barber's shop. His right earlobe was completely gone." Chapter 19. Commissaire Taillard viewed the pink-faced hairdresser and the three young people sitting on the opposite side of her desk. The besuited figure of the Scottish lawyer Simon Gold stood behind them, leaning his hands on the back of a chair. Whatever his faults, Enzo MacLeod certainly inspired loyalty among his family and friends, and she felt a tiny pang of regret with the thought that she, too, might have been one of that inner circle, that sérail, had things turned out differently between them. "It doesn't prove that he wasn't there," she said. Simon straightened himself and tugged at his beard with long, bony fingers. "And the fact that you found his hair at the scene doesn't prove that he was. He was having a relationship with a woman, for God's sake. People shed hair. You might expect to find some of his hair on her clothes." Kirsty cut in. "The point is, why would someone pay 100 euros for some of my father's hair if it wasn't to incriminate him?" Sophie added, "And why would somebody set him up with a phony doctor's appointment if it wasn't to blow his alibi out of the water?" Commissaire Taillard shook her head. "This is all just speculation." Simon said, "In the same way, Commissaire, that the only evidence you have is circumstantial." But the police chief was conceding nothing. "We have a computer diary entry that places him at the scene at the time of the murder. We have hair that ties him to the body of the victim, and his alibi is laughable. People have been convicted on less." Simon said, "Just stop and think for a moment, Commissaire.
If you were going to commit a murder, wouldn't you come up with a better alibi? You know that Enzo is not a stupid man. Why would he invent such a ridiculous story in the full knowledge that it wouldn't stand up to a moment's scrutiny? There was a knock at the door, and it was opened by a uniformed officer, but Commissaire Taillard's thoughts were focused elsewhere.
No one is suggesting that the murder was premeditated. It might well have been a crime of passion, a moment of anger, and Enzo MacLeod left town almost straight afterwards. He probably never imagined that we might tie him to the scene. He never had time to concoct a credible alibi. And the fact is that the building in the Rue des Trois Baudous had been empty for 2 years.
No, it hadn't.
Everyone turned towards the door.
Nicole stood clutching a beige folder and looking very pleased with herself. She was breathless and slightly flushed.
I've been around every agence immobilière in Cahors trying to find out who had 24 bis Rue des Trois Baudous on their books. Turned out to be an estate agent at the foot of the Boulevard Léon Gambetta.
She waved her beige folder in the air.
And guess what? They rented the building to a Paris-based company 3 weeks ago. A 1-year lease.
Hélène Taillard gave a tiny Gallic shrug of dismissal.
I don't see how that helps Monsieur MacLeod.
Nicole said,
Well, if you check with the registrar of the commercial court in Paris, as I just did, I think you'll find that the company which took the lease doesn't exist.
Everyone took a moment to digest this. Then Sophie leaned forward on the desk and looked earnestly at the police chief.
Madame Taillard, you know my dad didn't do this. You guys were—
She stopped suddenly, halted by an image of the semi-undressed Hélène Taillard on the canapé with her father, a shared memory which brought a flush to the older woman's cheeks.
Well, you were pretty close. You know there's not a bad bone in his body. He'd be incapable of killing anyone.
The commissaire sat back in her seat and sighed deeply.
I wouldn't disagree with you, Sophie, but it's not my call to make. I am the chief of police. I am bound by rules and procedures. There is a limit to how much I can intervene. The juge d'instruction already thinks I am compromised because I know your father socially.
Simon took the folder from Nicole.
But surely, Commissaire, the testimony of the hairdresser and the fact that the building in the Rue des Trois Baudous was leased by a company which doesn't exist throws further doubt on an already weak case.
He smiled, a persuasive smile of reassurance, normally reserved for a jury during summing up.
Perhaps, in the light of developments, you might consider discussing with the juge d'instruction the possibility of letting Enzo out on police bail.
Enzo stepped out from the glass-fronted Hôtel de Police and drew his first breath as a free man in nearly 48 hours. Brittle leaves from the plane trees in the car park lay in drifts among the cars and rattled across the tarmac in the icy breeze that blew down from the old city walls. Inside him welled a great, burning sense of anger, greater even than his sense of injustice or his relief at being released unexpectedly on bail. Someone had murdered an innocent woman, just to set him up as a suspect. In order to create a false alibi, he had been duped into a consultation with a phony doctor and suffered through 2 days of believing he was dying from an incurable disease. That same someone had tried to murder his daughter and burned down Bertrand's gym. It had all been one-way traffic, all designed to ruin his life, to distract him from an investigation that someone feared would uncover a murderer who until now had escaped justice. Of that Enzo was certain. But he was certain, too, that he had reached a turning point, a moment in this whole sad and sordid tale when his adversary had done his worst, and in doing so revealed enough of himself to give Enzo a starting point to fight back. He clung to that thought with a grim tenacity.
"You don't look very happy to be out."
Enzo turned to look at Commissaire Taillard. She had walked him up to the front door from the cells.
"I'm sorry," he said. "I don't mean to be ungrateful. I ought to thank you for everything you've done."
She took his arm and led him through the trees towards the Musée de la Résistance on the corner.
"Don't thank me yet, Enzo. This isn't over. There is still a killer out there, and a few of my officers still think it's you. But you don't." Her concession was reluctant. "I never really did, Enzo. In fact, I might even have put money on you being innocent." His smile was rueful. "You bet on me once before and lost. You got lucky on the Jacques Gaillard case. I don't hold that against you." They stopped, and she turned to face him, her breast lightly brushing his arm. There was a moment between them, a tiny frisson suggesting that perhaps the flame hadn't been entirely extinguished. He said, "The only way I'm going to clear my name here is by catching the killer myself." She shook her head. "That's our job." He gave her a look, but refrained from comment. "There must be something you can tell me, Helene, about the murder or the crime scene, something that would give me a starting point." "Absolutely not. You're just out on bail, Enzo. I can't go divulging information like that to a suspect." "If I really did it, you wouldn't be telling me anything I didn't already know. At least tell me how she was murdered." Commissaire Taillard held him in a long, hard stare before blowing through pursed lips in exasperation. "She was struck on the face, sufficiently hard probably to render her unconscious, but that's not what killed her. The pathologist's preliminary autopsy report says her neck was broken." Enzo stiffened. "Deliberately? I mean, she didn't break it accidentally when she fell?" "Oh, no. The médecin légiste was quite clear. The neck was broken by a clean, twisting movement that severed the spinal cord between the third and fourth disarticulated vertebrae. A real pro job was how he described it." Enzo whistled softly. "Then I know who did it." "What?" The commissaire looked at him in disbelief. "At least I know who else he's killed. In a Paris apartment nearly 17 years ago." His eyes shone with the cold, hard steel of revenge. "Which also means I know where to start looking for him." Chapter 20. London, England, July 1986. He had been surprised at how easy it was. The newspaper's archives were open for anyone to see, transferred now to microfiche, viewable on any one of a number of machines in the reading room. Richard had found the offices of the Daily Mail easily enough. It was before the Associated Press had moved its headquarters to Kensington, and its suite of newspapers was still to be found in the old Northcliffe House in Whitefriars Street, not far from Fleet Street. He was not quite sure why he had chosen the Daily Mail, except that it seemed a little classier than the other tabloids, but still certain to carry stories of popular interest. He had no idea what he was looking for, but he had a starting date, one imprinted in his memory, just as it had been burned in red into the bottom corner of the photograph. July 23rd, 1970. Almost exactly 16 years ago. Outside, the city of London baked under the hot July sun, bankers and journalists finally abandoning coats and jackets for open-necked shirts and summer frocks. But in here it was dark and cool, and Richard's focus was on the screen in front of him as he wound the spool through the reader. He found July 23rd quickly enough, but if anything newsworthy had happened, it would surely have come after that date. Nothing up until then, at least, had disturbed the happiness of a family on a Spanish beach. He spooled quickly through that day's news stories before moving on to the 24th, but it wasn't until the 25th that he found what he was looking for, and it shook him to the core. "Snatched" was the headline, and the subhead read, "Toddler taken from Spanish holiday hotel." Richard ran hungry eyes over the text of the story. The Bright family from Essex were still in shock today after the abduction of their 20-month-old son Richard from their Spanish hotel room. The only traces left by his abductors were the child's blood-stained panda and a smeared trail of blood leading into the hall. The kidnappers appear to have made their escape down an emergency staircase at the back of the building. Police in the tiny Spanish coastal resort of Cadaqués, near the home of artist Salvador Dali, have sent blood samples for testing. They hope to be able to determine whether the blood belonged to the kidnapped toddler or one of his abductors. Local police chief Manuel Sanchez said,
We have no idea yet why the child was taken. There has been no demand for ransom. If it turns out that the blood was that of the little boy, then I think we have to fear the worst." The alarm was raised late on the evening of Thursday the 23rd when Richard's parents returned to their room from a meal in the hotel dining room. They had left baby Richard, brother William, and older sister Lucy asleep in the room, confident that the children would be safe while they ate. A hotel babysitting service had been employed to check on the children every 15 minutes, but in fact no one had looked in on the room for more than an hour. It was after midnight before the local police informed the area headquarters in Girona, and it was another 8 hours before police forces throughout Spain were put on alert. Pictures of the kidnapped Richard were flashed on nationwide Spanish television yesterday, along with a public appeal for information. Investigating officers are now sifting through dozens of reported sightings, from Cadiz to San Sebastian. Distraught parents Rod and Angela were yesterday being comforted by friends and family. A family spokesman told reporters, "We are still hopeful of having little Richard returned to us, and we would appeal to whoever might have taken him not to harm him. Leave him somewhere safe and inform the police." The one-time fishing port of Cadaqués is situated on a remote peninsula north of Barcelona on the Costa Brava. A haven for writers and artists, it is regarded as an upmarket resort, unspoiled and largely underdeveloped. There were photographs of the whitewashed Mediterranean houses of the old port with an inset picture of the bizarrely mustachioed surrealist Salvador Dali. A snapshot of the missing boy, grinning at the camera. Richard stared for a long time at the picture. A shock of blonde curls above a chubby, round face. He had seen enough photographs of himself at this young age to be in no doubt that he was the abducted child. He wondered if the strange, fragmented images that now flooded his thoughts were real memories or imagined ones provoked by the shock of reading about his own abduction. He thought he could remember a darkened room, a woman bending over his cot, lifting him into safe arms, his fingernail catching her cheek, sticky blood on his fingers, his panda falling to the floor, and then, out of the darkness, being carried from a car, the sound of the sea somewhere far below, exhaling into the night, filling cool air with its salted perfume. So his mother was not really his mother, and all that suffocating love, her soft, warm bosom and rose-scented cologne crowding his senses, throttling his childhood, had in the end driven a wedge between them. He realized now it had really been some desperate attempt to win him over, as if somehow he had known the truth. Was it possible that he really did remember something? That it was those memories that in some way prevented the two of them from ever having a normal relationship? How disappointed by him she must have been. He spooled through the ensuing days. The story was never off the front pages, with background pieces and featured articles inside. Experts speculated on the reasons for the abduction, everything from the white slave trade and sexual abuse to a secret sale on the underground adoption market. Kidnapping for financial reasons had been ruled out when no ransom demand was made. And in any case, Rod Bright, while a successful businessman in Ilford, could hardly have been described as wealthy. There was an in-depth article about the Bright family themselves, Rod and Angela and their 3 children, but Richard couldn't bring himself to read it. Not yet, anyway. Days and weeks passed before his eyes as gradually the story slipped from the front pages, a tale of frustrating police failure confining itself to smaller and smaller paragraphs on the inside, until finally it simply disappeared. Upheavals in Northern Ireland were now grabbing the headlines. The Social Democratic and Labour Party had been forced to fight for Catholic civil rights in the troubled province. And then suddenly, 6 weeks later, a young female journalist from the newspaper's features staff had flown out to Spain to interview Angela Bright. She was still in Cadaqués, and refusing to leave until either her child was returned to her or he was proven to be dead. The blood, it had turned out, was not his. To leave, she told the journalist, would be a betrayal of her son. It would be to abandon him, to admit that he was gone forever, and she simply couldn't do it. And so this picturesque resort, where discerning people took their holidays, had become a prison a gilded cage that would hold her until either she found her Richard or she died. She had already rented a house and was discussing with the local authority the possibility of putting her children into the state school. Her husband, meantime, had returned to England, where his business interests demanded his presence. There was a photograph of her sitting in a wicker chair, staring forlornly at the camera. Richard stared back at her for a very long time. He had evidently inherited his colouring from his mother. Fair hair, and even from the black-and-white photograph he could see that she had the palest of eyes, almost certainly blue like his. But she looked substantially older than her 33 years. Drawn. Haunted. He looked away, unable to maintain eye contact with this ghost from his past, blinking hard to disperse the tears that filled his eyes. He stood up and went in search of the index. Now that he knew what story he was following, he would be able to find all future references and go straight to them. As it turned out, there were very few. How quickly the world forgot the suffering it shared over breakfast for a few brief days or weeks. The last reference he could find was in September 1976, on the occasion of his 8th birthday. Some news editor had figured it was an anniversary on which to hang a story. Perhaps it had been a poor month for news. And so a reporter had been dispatched to do a follow-up interview with Angela Bright, who was still in Cadaqués, a free holiday for a journalist from the features desk. Senora Bright, as she was now known locally, had purchased a large house just below the church which sat up at the top of the town overlooking the bay. The elder of her remaining children, Lucy, had just started secondary school. Richard's brother William was still in primary school. Angela and Rod had separated 18 months previously. A good Catholic, Angela was refusing to give him a divorce, but their marriage was over. He had wanted to move on, and she was unable to do so. Still locked up in her gilded cage, resigned to spending the rest of her days there, believing that her son might be dead, but never quite able to release her grip on that last shred of hope that he might somehow, somewhere, still be alive. She prayed for him each morning in the church just a few paces from her door, and spent her days in quiet solitude behind shuttered windows, or in the cool shade of her tiny, walled garden. In the photograph she seemed to have aged 20 years. There were photographs, too, of his brother and sister, and short interviews with each, and Richard realized for the first time what he had missed by skimming through all those previous pieces, what would certainly have become clear to him had he read the article on his family background. He stared at the screen with an extraordinary sense of déjà vu, and felt himself free-falling once more into the abyss. Chapter 21. As they crossed the square, Enzo looked up, beyond the red brick of the old town, to the tree-covered hills rising all around the far side of the river, cutting a high, dark line against the deep blue of the winter sky.
"I'm going to get the bastard."
As if he hadn't spoken, Simon said, "I have a flight from Toulouse at 4. They had walked together without speaking down through Cahors, past the imposing Palais de Justice, where Enzo might yet stand trial, across the busy Boulevard Gambetta, and into the Rue Marshal Foch, leading into the Place Jean-Jacques Chaput. The cathedral stood in chilly silence, casting its shadow of Christian disapproval on the thoughts of revenge that filled Enzo's head. He had been so wrapped up in them as they passed through the town that he had failed to register Simon's unusually sombre mood. Simon had always been mercurial. At one moment, the manic extrovert, saved only by his charm from the consequences of a destructive impulsiveness. At another, the manic depressive, who, in the blink of an eye, might descend into a black funk from which it could be almost impossible to rouse him. His mood this cold November morning, as a pale sun sent long shadows sprawling north across the square, was neither manic nor depressive. He was subdued, and his breath clouded in frigid air as he spoke.
"I'm in the middle of a court case in Oxford. Only got the judge to agree to a 2-day suspension of proceedings by pleading a family emergency."
A woman with big yellow rubber gloves was packing ice around freshly displayed fish in the Lucien fishmonger on the corner.
"Well, at least come up to the apartment and have a glass of wine with me. I could do with a drink."
"No,
I need to talk to you. We can talk in the apartment. In private."
For the first time, Enzo detected something ominous in his friend's tone. He glanced at him and saw the shadows beneath his orange-flecked green eyes.
"I'll buy you a drink in the Forum, then."
He steered him past a blue-and-white 2CV with a crumpled fender and into the café on the south side of the square, opposite the indoor market of La Halle. A butcher's van was unloading fresh meat in the street under the watchful gaze of an Alsatian dog, whose dreadlocked owner squatted in a doorway begging cup on the sidewalk in front of him. Inside, steam issued from a coffee-maker behind the red brick bar. Enzo ordered a couple of brandies, and several customers shook his hand as Simon followed him in back. A rerun of a rugby game was being shown on a television screen high up above the door. They slipped into leather bench seats to face each other across the booth by the cheminée. They both felt the warmth of smouldering oak embers that filled the place with a sweet scent of winter wood smoke. They sat in silence until the brandies came, and Enzo could feel Simon's tension.
"Santé."
He lifted his glass to his lips, and the liquor burned its way down into his chest. Simon just stared at his glass before looking up and meeting his friend's eye with a curiously loaded stare.
"You're a fucking idiot, Magpie. You know that?"
"What?" Enzo was startled. This was no idle jibe made half in jest. This was a heartfelt criticism made whole in earnest.
"She was better off before."
"Who?"
"Kirsty. When she wasn't talking to you. When you had no contact. Nobody was trying to kill her then."
Enzo sighed and let himself slip back in his seat. So that's what this was all about. After Enzo and Linda had broken up, Simon had stayed in touch, with Enzo's ex playing the role of surrogate father to the surly Kirsty. It was Simon who had been there on school sports day. It was Simon who had taken Kirsty and her mother out for a celebration meal when Kirsty graduated. It was Simon, during all the years that Enzo wasn't around, who had kept a mindful eye on his absent friend's daughter.
"She almost died in the catacombs in Paris. Someone's just tried to murder her in Strasbourg. And why? Because of you. Because of your stupid bets, and your stupid pride, and this crazy crusade to solve every cold case in France."
He paused.
"Or at least all the ones in Raffin's book."
He was on a roll.
"Just to show the world how fucking clever you are. Enzo MacLeod. Great mind, great scientist. Smarter than all the rest. Look at me, mammy. I'm dancing."
Enzo's face stung, as shock brought colour to cold cheeks. He felt as if he had been struck. There was vitriol in Simon's accusation, searing words smeared with Scottish sarcasm. And he wasn't finished.
"Do you care at all that you're putting at risk the very people you profess to love?"
Enzo remembered how Simon had been the leading light in the school debating society, and while he could at times be vulgar and foul-mouthed along with the rest of them, he'd had a talent for being able to articulate his opinions with cutting clarity, making him, of course, an ideal lawyer. And if he meant to pour petrol on the coals of Enzo's anger, then he succeeded.
"Don't lecture me on fatherhood, Si. You've never stayed in a relationship long enough to be one. You're more likely to be having sex with a girl Kirsty's age than worrying about her well-being."
Simon glared back at him, stung by the rebuke, perhaps because there was more than just a grain of truth in it.
"You just walked away from her." "Not my choice. Of course it was. You were the one who left, not Kirsty. She didn't ask for that. Now she's suffering the consequences of reconciliation. And what are you going to do? You're going to go after this guy. You're going to put her in even more danger. You just don't care, do you?" "Of course I care. Jesus Christ, man, if I don't stop this guy, no one else will. And now that I know it's not just me he's after, do you not think I'm going to do everything I can to protect the people I love?" "How? How are you going to do that, Magpie? Send them to Mars? Get real. You don't know who this guy is. You don't know the first thing about him. But he knows everything about you. He could be sitting in this café,
and you wouldn't even know it."
Involuntarily, Enzo's eyes strayed beyond the booth to the customers smoking and drinking at other tables. It was true. Apart from the regulars whom he recognized, he could not have said who any of the others were. A young man, La Dépêche, open on the table in front of him, was sipping a steaming noisette. He glanced up and caught Enzo watching him before his eyes dipped self-consciously back to his newspaper. A middle-aged man at the bar was engaged in an animated conversation with the proprietor. He was dark, muscular, a fading tattoo on his right forearm. Enzo had never seen him before. He forced himself to meet Simon's critical gaze.
"Nothing's going to happen to Kirsty, or Sophie, or anyone else. I'd die before I'd let that happen."
Even as he spoke the words, he realized how hollow they were, and he could see in Simon's eyes that he knew it too. How could he possibly keep his children safe from an enemy he couldn't even see? Simon leaned slightly towards him and lowered his voice.
"Just so you know, Enzo, anything happens to that girl." "And what?"
But whatever response might have reached the tip of Simon's tongue remained behind pursed lips. He simply got up, his brandy untouched, and weaved his way between the tables to where cold sunlight slanted across the cobbles outside. Enzo had forgotten that Raffin was there. The journalist had not visited him at the caserne, but Enzo remembered seeing his bag in Kirsty's room when Commissaire Taillard brought him to the apartment to look for the doctor's letter. He was not particularly pleased to see him, and barely had time to consider why Simon's disapproval did not extend to Kirsty's relationship with Raffin before he was mobbed by the girls. They took it in turns to hug and kiss him and fretted and fussed collectively. Enzo caught Raffin watching him with a slight sardonic smile, the old sage surrounded by his adoring acolytes. He had been surprised, too, to see Nicole.
"Where are you staying?" he asked her. "She's sharing with me."
Something in Sophie's tone communicated a certain discontent.
"Where's Uncle Si?"
Enzo turned away towards the séjour.
"He's had to go back to England."
Bertrand rose from the table where he was poring over papers and catalogues. He gave Enzo a strong handshake.
"Good to see you back in the land of the living, Monsieur MacLeod."
Enzo nodded towards the papers strewn across the table.
"What's all this about?"
"Just trying to work out how much I need to borrow from the bank to cover the cost of new equipment."
"How much?"
"A lot. I don't think I can afford my wish list, so I'm trying to cut it down."
Enzo crossed to his bureau and returned to the table with his checkbook. He sat down opposite Bertrand and held out his hand for the 2 estimates.
"Let me see."
He scanned the sheets that Bertrand had handed him, then opened his checkbook and started writing. Bertrand watched him, perplexed.
"What are you doing, Monsieur MacLeod?"
Enzo tore out the check he had written and held it for Bertrand to take.
"Get your wish list, Bertrand. Tell the bank you don't need their loan. You can pay me back when the insurance money comes through."
Bertrand looked at the check and shook his head.
"You can't afford this, Monsieur MacLeod."
"With all due respect, Bertrand, how would you know what I can afford?"
He snapped his checkbook shut.
"I've been to the bank and transferred money from my savings account to my checking account."
"Papa, that's all the money you've got in the world."
Sophie was staring at him in disbelief. Enzo smiled.
"You know, one thing that occurred to me, Sophie, when I thought I only had a few months left. What a crime it would be to die with money in the bank."
"But you're not going to die now."
"We're all going to die sometime, Soph. And anyway, I expect Bertrand to pay me back before then, so don't worry, your inheritance is safe. Or at least what'll be left of it after the French government have taken their pound of flesh."
"Oh, Papa!"
She scowled at him. Bertrand stood still frozen with a cheque in his hand.
"I can't take this, Monsieur MacLeod."
"Of course you can. And anyway, I need a favour in return, Bertrand. There's no such thing as a free loan."
"Anything."
"I need you to come with us. Someone to look after my girls."
Nicole preempted both daughters, including herself, without a second thought, as one of Enzo's girls.
"Where are we going?"
"There's someone out there trying to destroy me, Nicole. Someone who burned down Bertrand's gym, who tried to kill Kirsty. Someone who murdered a woman the same way he murdered a young man in a Paris apartment nearly 17 years ago."
He lifted his eyes to meet Raffin's, and he saw the journalist frown.
"The Pierre Lambert case?"
And when Enzo nodded,
"How do you know that?"
MO. A trademark killing. Spinal cord severed between the third and fourth vertebrae. A mistake because it gives us a starting point. But this guy is still a ruthless, cold-blooded killer who's prepared to do anything to stop me finding out who he is. So no one's safe. None of us. Not until we get him."
He let his gaze wander around the 5 sets of eyes fixed upon him.
"We need somewhere that's not known to him. Somewhere safe. A base from where we can start to track him down."
Sophie said,
"What about Charlotte's cottage in the Corrèze?"
Enzo shook his head.
"He knows everything about me, Soph. Charlotte's in the States right now, so she's safe, but he's bound to know about her, so he'll know about the cottage. We need to make a complete break with everyone and everywhere we know."
Kirsty said,
"Do you have some place in mind?"
Enzo reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of hotel notepaper.
"Actually, I do."
Chapter 22. Bertrand drew his van into the curb beneath the stark, leafless skeletons of the plane trees in front of the station. Enzo held the door open for Nicole to step down and glanced anxiously across the street. There were a couple of men in the Hertz car rental office bent over the counter, intent on signing paperwork. The Maison du Vin de Cahors appeared deserted. A man sat reading a newspaper in the weak winter sunshine outside the bar of the Melchior Brasserie. He didn't look anything like either Kirsty or Xavier's description of the man with the missing earlobe, but that made no difference. The man whom Kirsty had seen in Strasbourg was not necessarily the killer, and the murderer had already employed someone to play the role of Enzo's oncologist. They had no way of knowing who else might be in his employ. Sophie leaned out to kiss her father and squeeze his hand.
"Take care," she whispered.
Only by dividing and subdividing themselves could they hope to shake off anyone with a watching brief. Raffin had already set off in a hire car with Kirsty. Enzo slammed the door, and Bertrand revved his engine, peeping on his horn before pulling away, and accelerating up the steep incline of the tree-lined Avenue Charles de Freycinet. Nicole clutched her suitcase nervously. It was, as always, huge, and packed to capacity. Enzo had no idea what she took with her on her travels, but her valise was invariably too heavy for her to lift. He was pleased to see that she had invested for the first time in a case with wheels, and offered to take it from her without fear of slipping a disc.
"Do you think he's watching?"
she said in a low voice, trying not to move her mouth.
"Probably not, Nicole. But even if he is, I doubt if he can lip-read."
He trundled her case across the tarmac, and doors slid open to admit them to the main concourse. It was crowded with passengers awaiting the imminent arrival of the train to Paris. Others were gathered to greet friends and family travelling up from Toulouse. Through yet more sliding doors they stood in a queue at the billetterie until waved forward to a guichet. The girl behind the glass said a weary bonjour. Enzo slipped her a sheet of paper containing the code and details of the booking they had made on the internet just an hour before. The girl glanced at the two faces watching her through the window.
"Just the one ticket?"
Enzo nodded.
"Just the one."
A dot matrix printer chattered and spat it out. The girl slid it under the glass.
"Bonne journée."
They passed back through the concourse, and Enzo made an extravagant show of validating the single ticket in the bonne by the door to the platform, and then handing it ostentatiously to Nicole. The message would be clear to anyone watching. Only Nicole was travelling. Enzo bumped her case downstairs to the underpass, and then up again to the platform where they stood, shivering in the cold wind that blew down the railway lines from the north.
"I'm scared, Monsieur MacLeod,"
Nicole whispered. Her eyes were darting back and forth along the length of the quay, flickering from face to face, assessing each as a potential killer, ruling some out and some in.
"Do you really think he might be here?"
"Impossible to know, Nicole, which is why we're not going to take any chances." The SNCF jingle echoed high among the steel girders of the steeply pitched glass roof, and a voice warned passengers to stand back from the edge of the platform. The Paris train from Toulouse would be arriving in just a few moments. Enzo peered south and saw the train rounding the bend in the distance. When finally it groaned and creaked to a halt, doors flew open up and down its length, and passengers streamed out to fight for space with those queuing up to get on, a confluence of conflicting interests. Enzo waited until others ahead of them had climbed into the train before he hoisted Nicole's case up to chest level to push it through the door. The effort left him perspiring, tiny beads of sweat turning immediately cold as they formed around his eyes. Nicole threw her arms around him and kissed him on both cheeks.
"Goodbye, Monsieur MacLeod."
Enzo could almost believe she had tears in her eyes. He stood back as she climbed aboard and swung the door shut, and then he walked along the platform, following her progress through the coach until she found her seat. She sat by the window and pressed her forehead against it, looking down at him with concern. She gave a tiny wave. Enzo waved back, and as the crowds thinned, swallowed by the stairway that led down to the underpass, the guard raised his hand and gave a sharp blow on his whistle. Several more doors slammed, and the train jerked and sighed and began its slow progress out of the station. Enzo walked with it, waving at Nicole as it gathered speed, until he could only have kept up with it by running. He glanced down the platform. There were just a handful of people left on it now, and he grabbed a door handle as it passed, running with it and swinging the door wide. He heard the shouts of the guard somewhere behind him. If he mistimed his leap, he would be in serious trouble. He took off, and felt himself flying through the air, hovering for what seemed like an eternity on the swing of the door before his feet found the steps and he scrambled up into the train. As he leaned out to pull the door closed, he glanced once more back along the platform. No one else had attempted to jump aboard the moving train, and he felt confident that if anyone had been following him, then they had just lost him. The door slammed shut, and he stood breathing hard, back pressed against the wall. He was too damned old for this. Nicole was watching for him as the carriage door slid open, and he staggered unsteadily along the central aisle. She gave him another hug.
"I was so worried you were going to break your neck, Monsieur MacLeod."
"Yeah, well, that's exactly what'll happen to me if we let this guy get too close."
He slumped into the seat beside her and glanced at his watch. They would be at Souillac in an hour and meet up again with Bertrand and Sophie. He looked up and saw the conductor approaching from the far end of the carriage. He sighed. The more immediate problem was going to be trying to explain why he didn't have a ticket. Chapter 23. Late afternoon sunlight slanted yellow across a landscape that lay somewhere between fall and winter. Trees clinging to the hillsides that rose up around them had retained much of their foliage, late autumn colours of russet and ochre smeared on green. As the sun sank lower, the valleys fell into deep shadow, while the rocky volcanic outcrops that broke a reddening skyline glowed orange in the last of the sun. The streams and rivers that cut and wound their way through them lay like silvered pink ribbons, everything magnified into pin-sharp focus by the cold, clear mountain air. The motor of Bertrand's van strained as they continued to climb, leaving below them the lush pastures of southwest France for the rocky wastes of the country's central plateau. Enzo could almost feel Raffin's impatience in the car behind. The road was climbing more steeply now, and their progress had slowed since leaving Aurillac. As night approached, the temperature was dropping fast. Even in the blast of hot air from the van's heating system, they could feel the cold creeping into their feet. Nicole sat in the front, between Sophie and Bertrand, the map on her knee. Enzo and Kirsty sat in the back, watching the changing landscape unfold, lit from behind them by a dramatic sunset. Nicole peered through an increasing gloom, into which their headlights now barely penetrated.
"There should be a left turn just up ahead. I guess it'll be signposted."
Conifers scaled the slopes around them, and night seemed to fall suddenly, like a cloak of darkness settling on the land.
"There it is."
The signpost caught their lights. Miramont 4. Bertrand dropped to second gear and swung them into the narrow single-track road. There would be a problem if they met another vehicle in the next 4 kilometres. They continued to climb through the trees for several minutes before suddenly the road took a sharp turn, and they emerged onto a high plateau bathed in unexpected moonlight. Away to the west, the sky still glowed the deepest red. Above them it was already crusted with stars sparkling like frost. The road followed a straight line then for 2 kilometres or more before beginning a slow descent through folds of rock and stubbled pasture into a shallow tree-filled valley, and they saw the lights of Miramont twinkling their welcome in the gathering night. Although the school and the church were floodlit, there was no sign of life in the village. Granite cottages huddled together under steeply pitched Auvergnat roofs of hand-chiselled stone lows, shutters closed already against the cold and the night. The water in the fountain in front of the church would be frozen by morning. She said it was a right turn at the head of the village. Enzo leaned forward from the back, then pointed. There, I think that's it. And across a barren winter field surrounded by tall trees stood a big, square house, lights blazing into the night from its tall, arched windows. They passed a swimming pool, covered over for the winter, and a pigeonnier with a double-tiered roof, before drawing up in front of stone steps climbing to the front door from either side of it. Raffin pulled in behind them, and they all got out stiffly onto the pebbled drive. Gardens dipped away below to a wall, and the field beyond, and the lights of the distant village spilled towards them across its fallow, furrowed rows. The front door opened, throwing light onto a slabbed terrace, and Anna stepped out to lean her hands on the wrought iron rail. She smiled down at the upturned faces and found Enzo's.
"Glad you could make it," she said.
She cocked an eyebrow.
"I hope I have enough rooms."
Her breath billowed in the chill night air.
"I have to confess I didn't really expect to see you again."
She glanced at him by the yellow of the street lights in the deserted main street of this ghost village. The only sign of life came from behind the steamed-up windows of the Bar Tabac restaurant, Chez Milou. They could hear voices raised in laughter inside. Enzo had known that they needed to talk, and suggested they take a walk somewhere away from the house. She had wrapped up in a winter coat and scarf and slipped her arm through his for added warmth. He glanced at her now and saw the lights in her cold, dark eyes, and remembered how attractive she was. He remembered, too, the touch of her skin, the firm, fit body of an athlete. He had made love to her, a dying man in desperate need of comfort. Now that his death sentence was lifted, he found himself wanting to make love to her again, this time slow and sure and gentle, in the knowledge that tomorrow could always wait. He smiled. "I was convinced of it." She tipped her head and looked at him quizzically.
"There's something different about you, Enzo. Hard to define. When we met in Strasbourg, you seemed like a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders. But now you seem, I don't know, less burdened."
"When we met in Strasbourg, I had 3 months to live, Anna. Now I've got as long as the next man, however long that might be."
She frowned, and he laughed.
"Someday, maybe, I'll tell you about it. But right now I owe you an explanation about why we're here. It wasn't something I could tell you on the phone. And if you want us to go, then we'll leave first thing in the morning."
She tightened her grip on his arm.
"Why would I want you to go? Even if I don't have you to myself, I'm not going to turn you away. It was starting to get pretty lonely up here. This is almost like having a family again."
They passed the mairie, with its French and European flags and tattered notice board, and he told her everything, about his history in forensic science in Scotland before coming to France to teach biology in Toulouse, about cracking the cold cases in Raffin's book of unsolved murders, about how one of the murderers was out to stop him any way he could, the attempt on his daughter's life, the burning of Bertrand's gym, the killing of an innocent woman to set up Enzo as the prime suspect. She listened in thoughtful silence, and as he glanced at her, it seemed to him that she had paled just a little. They needed a place, he said, where they would be safe from the killer, from where they could figure out who he was and how they could catch him. When he had finished, they walked on for some way in silence, past the 3 stories of the floodlit school to the end of the village, where finally she stopped and gazed across the ploughed field to the lights of the house. They could see Bertrand heaving Nicole's case up the steps to the door. She turned suddenly towards Enzo.
"That's pretty scary stuff."
"If you want us to go, I'll understand. But if we stay, we'll pay for our keep, and the kids will do what needs to be done around the house."
She pursed her lips, lost in momentary thought.
"And if you didn't have here, where else would you go?" He shrugged. "I don't know. We'd find a hotel somewhere, I guess." She looked very directly into his eyes. "I don't know anything about you, Enzo. Not really." He smiled ruefully.
"But you'll let us stay tonight, at least."
She hesitated for a long moment. "You can stay as long as you like. That night in Strasbourg, I knew nothing about you then. We were complete strangers, but you made me feel, I don't know, safe somehow. You still do. And if I can offer you safety in return—" She reached out and took his face in her hands, and he put his on her waist and leaned forward to kiss her. A soft, gentle kiss on cool lips. Then he took her in his arms and held her there.
"Thank you, Anna."
He felt her soft breath at his ear. "Are you sure your daughter won't be jealous of me? She didn't seem very pleased to find me in your room in Strasbourg."
"Daughters plural," Enzo said, "and since I have no say in their love lives, I don't see why they should have any in mine."
"A one-night stand?" Sophie looked at Kirsty incredulously. "Well, that's just typical," Nicole said, and the sisters turned to look at her. She flushed with embarrassment and backtracked. "Well, I mean, when your father's around, there never seems to be a woman very far away." Sophie turned back to Kirsty. "Someone had just tried to kill you, and he was picking up a woman in a bar?" They were in a large, wood-panelled sitting room with double doors opening off a long, stone-flagged hallway. Immediately opposite, the doors of an enormous kitchen stood wide, and good smells issued from a Rayburn stove set in the original cheminée. In the séjour, a log fire burned in a marble hearth laden with ornaments and candlesticks. The room was filled with big, comfortable sofas and armchairs, its walls hung with myriad paintings of washed-out, watercolour countryscapes of an alien land. Kirsty slouched in an armchair, relaxing for the first time in days, and felt guilty for having betrayed her father's secret. I guess he had other things on his mind. He thought he was dying after all. But Sophie wasn't about to be so forgiving. "So his answer was to go off and spend the night with someone he doesn't know?" "Leave him alone." Bertrand perched on the sofa behind Sophie. "The only reason we got somewhere to stay is because he met this woman in Strasbourg." "And we don't know any more about her than he does." Sophie was incensed. "What do you think, Monsieur Raffin?" They all turned towards Raffin, who was sitting at a small table by the window with his laptop running and a book open beside him. He looked up when he heard his name. "What?" "Never mind, Roger. It's not important." Kirsty waved a dismissive hand and turned towards her sister. "Let it go, Sophie, please. We're here now. Like her or not, she's given us a roof over our heads when we had nowhere else to go." "How much do you think she knows?" Bertrand said. "As much as Dad's telling her right now, I imagine." Kirsty ran long fingers back through silky hair. "Though how much that is, who knows? It's a lot to dump on someone out of the blue, particularly someone you've only known for one night." They heard the sound of the front door opening and turned expectantly towards the hall. Enzo and Anna brought the cold in with them.